He operated this key and this button for a reason that we don't know yet. But we can analyze it that the intention was to destroy this plane.
Breaking right now, a French prosecutor revealing today that downed Germanwings flight was crashed deliberately after its 28-year-old co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, locked the captain out of the cockpit and initiated a deliberate descent minutes before that flight crashed in the French Alps. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Kleffler in New York. This morning, that French prosecutor detailing the early stage of their investigation into what was on that cockpit voice recorder. Here's more of what he had to say.
Here, a number of appeals and calls from the pilot to access the cockpit. There was no response from the co-pilot. He knocked on the door and demanded that the door should be open, and there was no response from the co-pilot. At that time, we heard a breathing noise inside the cabin, and we carried on hearing that kind of breathing until the final crash. The co-pilot is a German citizen for national thing. I don't understand his ethnicity, but he is a German pilot. He's not known as a terrorist, if that's what you meant. Absolutely not.
I think voluntary, he refused to open the door, and he turned the button to get down the plane.
He operated this key and this button for a reason that we don't know yet. But we can analyze it that the intention was to destroy this plane. Apparently, it's impossible, otherwise the pilot would have done it. If the pilot could have opened the door, which was a very strong door, the pilot would have done it.
A very shocking, very surprising revelation in the investigation. And I want to bring in our aviation analyst, John Nance, who is standing by watching and listening to all this as the investigation continues on. John, your initial thoughts on this new development?
Well, it's shocking because I thought that what we were dealing with was pilot incapacitation. I mean, we knew this was a possibility when we began to discern yesterday that the silence and the descent of the airplane probably indicated that they weren't talking on air traffic control frequencies, indicated that there was something wrong. But what I thought was probably wrong was that we had pilot incapacitation. This is a horror story. We've had 3 of these now that we know of, and possibly a 4th in the past 20 years, of pilot suicide and mass murder. And it's very disturbing because if you can't trust the people up front in the airplane any more than you could trust a surgeon, for instance, where are we? How do we screen people to make sure this doesn't happen again? Those are the thoughts that immediately come to mind.
The French prosecutor saying, in fact, that the plane had reached a cruising altitude of about 38,000 feet. It was shortly after that time that the pilot left the cockpit, and that apparently is when the cockpit door was closed and locked, and you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder a light tapping that then eventually grows louder. Explain how this locking mechanism works in a cockpit and how the pilot would have possibly tried to get back in.
Well, the philosophy behind it is simple. After 9/11, we want to make sure that the bad guys don't have an opportunity to get up there. So when a pilot comes out of the cockpit, in the United States, we have a flight attendant step in. So it's a no-lone zone. You never have one person up there alone. In this instance, apparently they don't do it that way. And so one pilot steps out to go to the bathroom, for instance, closes and locks the door. When he's ready to come back, usually you pick up the interphone and call your buddy and give him the password. In this case, though, knocking on the door is a way to do it. Probably not as secure. But no response meant that what they would go to is the keypad. The keypad over on the right side of the door, you put a special code in that only the pilot's flight attendants know, and it rings a chime in the cockpit. And if there's an incapacitated situation, a pilot who's slumped over, for instance, then the door will automatically pop open in about 5 seconds. But if somebody up there doesn't want you up there, in other words, if the pilot, and this was the philosophy, thinks that someone is invading the cockpit and has coerced the code out of one of the crew members, he or she can press a deny button and you will not get that door open. That apparently is what happened here.
In trying to piece together exactly what happened, then how key is that breathing that the French prosecutor said that you can hear on that cockpit voice recorder, presumably of the co-pilot inside the cockpit alone?
It's an interesting conclusion at this point, but by the way, this is the reason that we have to have cameras in cockpits. It's idiotic that we don't. But they're listening to the breathing and considering that the pattern that they're hearing is consistent with somebody who is conscious, alert, and doing something that they intend to do. Now, they did not say this, but if it does have, if what was installed in this airplane is one of those keypads with the chime system, and if there was an affirmative denial of access, they would have heard that as well. They would have heard the chime go off, and they would have heard the click of the deny button. And that is conclusive in terms of somebody not wanting the other pilot to come back up, in this case the captain.
Is there any indication, can you fathom any potential rationale for this, for if in fact someone wanted to bring down this plane, why they would do it in such a fashion of a descent like this as opposed to just bringing it in an uncontrolled manner?
Well, that was one of the puzzling elements, and one of the reasons that I thought yesterday that if this was a contest, if you will, between pilot incapacitation, this is when the New York Times story had just come out and they said there was one pilot locked out, it would seem to me that if there was going to be a murder-suicide, you would have seen specific manipulation of the controls, as we have seen in every other instance, that somebody wasn't just going to sit there and ride the airplane in on a steady course and a steady descent. But that is apparently exactly what this young man did.
This co-pilot had about 630 hours of flight time. How does that compare then to someone that might operate a plane of this size?
Well, that's an awful small amount of time, although we did for a long time have in the United States people getting into the right seat of commuter airlines, maybe with 300 hours, and it really wasn't a problem. Now there's a new law that requires anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 hours before you can do that, and it's creating a little bit of havoc in the industry. But the thing is not the amount of flying time, it's the screening. I mean, we've got people who are 30 and 40-year veterans who would be equally capable, I suppose, of coming completely unhinged and unbalanced as we do a 25 or 28-year-old pilot. I'm not sure it's the amount of experience that's the important point here. It's the level of screening, the type of scrutiny, and how in the world we got to the point of not knowing that this individual who's being trusted in a cockpit had this propensity.
John, let's go into it a little bit further, because the CEO of Lufthansa was saying that earlier today that the co-pilot did in fact pass all fitness tests. What kind of capacity then do airlines put these pilots through?
It's a standard psychological screening test. Most American carriers do the same thing, some a little bit more extensively than others. What they don't do is a full background check that goes into the sort of thing that you do in the military to get a top secret or a secret clearance, where people are going around talking to friends and family and getting a background picture. And even that, of course, is squishy science. It's not necessarily going to turn up something. And all of us as carbon-based human beings have the propensity for, we use the term snapping, but for changing somehow overnight and having something go wrong mentally that could lead to a suicidal thought. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about what a sequence leading to suicidal thinking would be. The problem is that we don't really have a good methodology of catching it, and our history in the United States has been no problems. We've been able to ferret people out just by watching each other.
All this information has been coming from the cockpit voice recorder that has painted this horrific scene, this event that had occurred from 38,000 feet down to the French Alps there. The flight data recorder, though, is still missing. Presumably, what information would be found on that once, in fact, it is found?
Well, I knew yesterday that the cockpit voice recorder was going to be the most important, but we need the flight data recorder too. We need to know what surfaces were moved and what this guy was doing in the right seat, whether he just set it and forgot it and let it go ahead and fly in, or whether he was actually manipulating the airplane. I didn't see much evidence of manipulation, but we need to know whether there was anything else going on with this airplane, because that's the essence of accident investigation. Even when you think you've got a clear track on what happened, there's always a multitude of supporting causal factors that we consider links in a causal chain. You need to know every one of them. So it's important to find that flight data recorder.
John, lastly, I want to ask you, can you see this pushing forward any kind of changes in the industry, maybe even a standardization from country to country as far as how airlines operate, extra security in cockpits, maybe installing cameras?
It had better start a debate. I mean, we really need to have a serious debate now, after Malaysia 370 and after this, on what kind of screening is going to be necessary. What kind of human reliability knowledge do we have, for instance, in the military? I'm an Air Force officer, and Air Force and Navy have for a long time handled nuclear weapons, and we've done it successfully by making sure that there was never a time that only one person was left alone with a nuclear weapon. Now, it's not perfect, but it certainly has worked well, as has the screening program, and I think we need to take lessons from that, and from the UK and from Germany, for that matter. All of us need to take a look at this, because obviously what we're doing is not enough.
John Nance, our aviation analyst. John, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Stay with ABC News Digital for continuing coverage of this mid-air mystery crash in the Alps. Keeping up to date in real time, downloading the ABC News app and starring the story for updates on the go. For now, I'm Dan Kleffler in New York.